Make Peace with Nature is a syndicated public affairs presentation of this station dealing with solutions to problems of energy, conservation, and the environment. Today's program will be hosted by David Serber.
Hello, and welcome to Make Peace with Nature. This program has been in continuous production and broadcast since May of 1973. This thanks to the interest and concern of the good people at WKRC TV Channel 12 in Cincinnati, a CBS affiliate and member of the Sinclair Broadcast Group of stations. More than 1,000 distinguished men and women have appeared in this forum to discuss solutions to threats to our air, water, and land. In recent years, the most important concern guests have expressed is global climate change, also known as global warming or the greenhouse effect. Some believe it is a hoax. However, 98% of qualified scientists and researchers believe the threat is real and directly related to human activity, and that these facts are beyond dispute. My studio guest believes the actions of Mr. Trump to minimize and even revoke the rules and regulations by which the EPA and other agencies have acted to reduce a broad range of pollution sources are of significant concern and perhaps even a clear and present danger. David Altman has been practicing attorney, in Cincinnati, Ohio since 1974, specializing in environmental law. He has an impressive track record of securing positive outcomes for individuals and organizations adversely affected by pollution and polluters. He is a graduate of the University of Cincinnati with a BS in political science and a JD degree in law. More after this.
The views expressed on Make Peace with Nature are those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station or the program's underwriters.
Since Mr. Altman has been on the show, so it's a great pleasure to welcome him back. How long has it been?
Well, I think about 20 years or so, by your best recollection and mine. But in the early days, in 1973, and we did a lot of shows, and it was my pleasure to tell about some of the early successes we've had and some of the early concerns we've had about the environment. And sadly, it looks like all that progress we've made may be about to change.
Well, I would interject one exception. You took the lead in organizing the fight to stop the Zimmer nuclear power plant. That was your project, and it was highly successful. It never opened as a nuclear power plant.
Well, the concern there was the safety and reliability of the plant, and with the help of people that perhaps be embarrassing to name, we were able to focus on safety and reliability. And the record was so bad there that after 2 years of fact-finding and fact educating and counteracting some maybe deceptive information, Wall Street pulled the plug on Zimmer and decided the funding wasn't a wise idea anymore.
You have a degree in law, but is there a specialty in which law students are currently trained who want to become environmental laws, or as in your case, did you just decide that's what you wanted to do?
Well, and I didn't decide that's what I wanted to do at all. As a matter of fact, I decided what I wanted to do was to give civic advice to cities and governments happened to be trained as a lawyer, but from 10 years of working on environmental issues in a civic arena. And then after 10 years of practice, well, maybe not, maybe 8, 7 years, I did one case, and that case turned out to open a career that I had not intended actually practicing environmental law. I wanted to be doing something about the environment as a lawyer, but I did not know on the enforcement side of things that you could actually sustain yourself and your law practice that way.
Are you able to tell the audience what that case was?
Yeah, that was Jones versus Enmond, and thanks to Judge Arthur Spiegel.
Jones being an individual person?
That's the lead plaintiff. Jocelyn and Ernie Jones were their names down in Harrison County, Kentucky.
Was it a class action suit?
No. I represented 5 families and
the Enmond being what, a chemical company?
Enmond was a chemical company that later was owned by BASF, and then when it was owned by BASF, the plant exploded.
I remember that day.
And I did handle, I was one of the 2 lead class counsels in that. But normally what our work is enforcement work, enforcing federal environmental law, not class actions, not class actions.
All right. Now, you are concerned, I believe I speak correctly, about Mr. Trump's actions to nullify what are called the rules and regulations, which are amendments to the EPA, the Clean Water, Clean Air Act, and other Toxic Substances Act. Who writes these regulations, and what are they for? Are they guidance for the EPA administrator? Right. Is that the idea?
A lot of people, certainly there are guidances, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the regulations and then rules that are established to give effect to the federal environmental laws. So Congress passes these laws, but Congress doesn't pass the details over how they're implemented. Congress authorizes, sometimes within narrow limits, sometimes within broad limits, what the EPA is supposed to do in order to clean the water, clean the air, clean up toxic waste, that sort of thing. Then the administrator of the EPA promulgates these regulations, and these regulations are tested sometimes even in the courts, and all parties, everybody with an interest has input into the regulations. We've had those regulations settled in a number of areas, and after years, new regulations that have been in the works for 10 years, 5 years, have just gone in the last 8 years into place, and a lot of the regulations and a lot of the rules that are established is what through executive order and was one device that's being used by the Trump administration. The other device is starving the EPA by lacerating its
cutting the budget.
And a third device will be discretion to enforce or, sadly, not to enforce the laws.
He gives that order?
Well, he puts somebody, his person, in place, and that person from Oklahoma was the leader in fighting enforcement in a broad health protecting measure of the environmental law. So it's always a wrestle. Do you protect the environment and public health, or do you allow industry to do more pollution or less cleanup? And there's huge discretion. So all you have to do is look at what the pronouncements are of the Trump administration, what they've done so far, and look at the regulations that have been and rules that have been changed by executive order, and you'll find that the U.S. EPA is the primary target of the Trump administration for deregulating. And that's simplifying things. That's really what we're talking about. Unabashedly deregulating. But the regulation is what has gotten us to the point where we've made progress on air, haven't finished water, and haven't finished by a long shot, and toxic waste cleanup. So deregulation is a code word for turning the clock back, and if you look at what's happened so far, you'll see that. What's interesting is labor is number 2 on the hit list, and that's way down compared to what's
the Labor
been done.
Department?
Labor issues that, again, industry would favor, and labor workers would not necessarily favor.
But I thought that those were part of his group,
Well, people also who are part of voters for him also drink water. They also breathe air.
Yes.
And hopefully they will realize before it's too late what's going to happen. Now on climate change, we can't really afford 4 years, but I'm primarily looking at those other laws and other regulations, because there's a ton of people that talk about climate change, and climate change is such a powerful and albeit widely important issue. People should be talking about it.
Wouldn't the lead agency on climate change be the EPA?
Yes, but I mean, I am here to talk about while we're waiting, and climate change is way, way too mild a phrase. It's world heating up, overheating. It's the world having a serious debilitating temperature. That's what's going on. But there's plenty of people that know way more about that than I do. What I represent are individual people, a lot of Trump-type voters who live in areas that voted for Trump, who are suffering from already it lacks environmental enforcement before the budget cuts, before all these things happen.
How could their situation deteriorate so quickly when he's only been in office 3 months?
Well, I'm saying, because of the way the government can work, the interrelationship of state government, federal government, and local government, a lot of these people already had problems and burdens that they had to take on. It's not a perfect world under Obama or any other president or under Bush, but they had a general commitment to environmental cleanup and not rolling back and not deregulating. Same with Clinton. And as a matter of fact, I think we did a few shows in the early days of the Clinton administration and talked candidly about what I expected there. But none of these people, and you remember when, of course, even when Nixon was president, you remember when Gerald Ford took over, we did interviews with people, none of whom were radical in terms of their desire to deregulate in the environmental area. They may have been interested in deregulation.
We must remember that Nixon signed the legislation creating the EPA.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So let me see if I understand it. We have to take a break in a couple of minutes. So the Congress, the Senate, and the House, the EPA is a cabinet position, and it was created by President Nixon. So all these years through the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and all the various other sub-acts, the real teeth of what they're doing is a series of rules and regulation, or is it just called regulation?
Both rules and regulations.
Right. Who writes those? The administrator of the EPA and her staff?
Well, in the first instance, it's the administrator of the EPA. That's who promulgates the implementation of the laws passed by Congress. So sometimes Congress gives very wide latitude to the administrator, sometimes the Congress gives very narrow latitude. And then without these rules and regulations, the laws don't work. You don't even have to repeal the law. When you've got the rules and regulations, you've gutted the law.
Do these rules and regulations have the force of law?
Yes, they are law.
Right.
And
then how can he sign an executive order nullifying them? Wouldn't he have to go to court and file an action?
Well, that's going to be the issue that's played out in the courts. However, let me remind you that the same person, the administrator who he appoints, the president always appoints, that administrator also is in charge of enforcing, and there's vast discretion.
I see.
So the minute word comes down that the executive doesn't want something, it's going to take lawsuits that may or may not even be effective to get the administrator to do what the administrator used to do before the time of deregulation, and bipartisan administrators of the EPA. Maybe people liked them less under one president or another, but this is something totally different. This is de facto backdoor repeal.
All right. We'll continue this after this break. Folks, stay with us, please.
The views expressed on Make Peace with Nature are those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station or the program's underwriters.
My guest back for a number of years ago, but still alive and well, obviously, and still successfully practicing environmental law in behalf of clients, associations, and concerned about the adverse effect that polluters and pollution have on our environment. Now, so it was interesting what you just said there a minute ago, that he signed an executive order actually revoking or nullifying, without reciting the exact language. Did he say that he's withdrawing these from effect so that they're not even on the books anywhere? So even if the EPA administrator thought, well, I think he's gone too far, her hands would be tied, or his hands would be tied.
The signal sent out by the orders, the effect of the orders, is to say we're deregulating a lot of the areas that have been regulated. For example, on the mountaintop strip mining, on anything that affects directly or indirectly the coal industry, the controversial, meaning industry didn't like it, utilities didn't like it, plan to clean up the coal-fired power plants, which are frankly not dying because of regulation of the EPA.
They're just too old.
Yeah, but dying because they're being beaten economically, as everybody knows, by natural gas, for example.
Right. So they're switching from coal to natural gas.
It's been going on. That's where the coal mining jobs have gone. But inexplicably, this administration wants to ice and restudy regulations that have been in the works for years, which, for example, allow discharges in the streams and waterways of coal-related products, and thereby crimping the Clean Water Act, and which is meant to stop those discharges.
How can this be stopped?
Well, one, that was a choice that I shouldn't say the American people, but the Electoral College made when it elected a president. And people were, shall we say, preoccupied with other issues, or they didn't care or understand what was going to happen on the environment?
Perhaps in fairness, they didn't realize that he would cut the budget of the EPA by 35% and sign executive orders.
Well, he actually did give a mixed message. One, he talked about deregulating.
Well, that's a broad term. That could be everything from deregulating the airlines to anything else.
And he did say we're going to have clean water and clean air. But everything he's done, the one focus they've had, even beyond labor is the point, has been the EPA and undoing a lot of this progress, not just climate change. And you can imagine that enforcement, which is completely at the discretion of the EPA direct administrator, is a client of the Attorney General. In other words, the Attorney General has to go litigate for the EPA on big cases.
Yes.
The EPA administrator, if it doesn't go to its lawyer, the Attorney General, and ask certain things be done, they won't be done, especially when they're both in the same administration and sit around the same cabinet table.
Have you filed any actions in state or federal courts to seek to nullify what he has done?
No, but the Earth Justice, the NRDC, the large national environmental, Earth Justice.
Don't you represent the Sierra Club?
I do in a lot of more localized regional matters, yes, even statewide matters. But yes, there are people beginning to file suits. But the point being, those will take years and may not offset the damage done, and certainly as pollution spreads, you once it's spread,
you can't put the
a
toothpaste
judge
back.
can't.
You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Sadly, it's very costly and very ineffective.
But I would have thought, and I'm not an attorney, as we both know, that when you would file a suit for the NRDC, Sierra Club, or whomever, whether you represent them or not, can't you request a stay so that the regulation remains in effect till the resolution?
In some instances, you actually can request a stay. And then there are complicated things you may have to do in order to get a stay, or you can even request an injunction to stop something. But the bond that would have to be posted is a deterrent, and whether the judge will grant it or not is a deterrent, because they may not want to. You just don't drive up to the courthouse and say, "Hey, judge, stop this. This doesn't work that way."
Do these actions, these suits that have been brought by the National Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and others that you mentioned, do they all have to go immediately to a federal court, a federal judge?
Well, they do want. We're talking about federal law. But here's the bigger picture. All those things are true, but here's what the viewer who breathes the air, et cetera, need to understand. The viewers need to understand that these regulations and laws are a myriad of things that have to be followed. They're preventative in nature. They're not the spectacular. It's all the little things you have to do, the net effect of which will be to see that the law is enforced. As you start pulling out the cards of these individual preventative regulations, which are not in and of themselves spectacular, perhaps not even interesting, you then begin to upset the entire structure of the federal environmental law. And then when you add to that cutting the budget to the agency that can then do very few things, and then on top of that you add in the discretion, you've destroyed pretty much the bottom layer of that house of cards that we call environmental law in this country, and it will cascade downward. And that is exactly what's being set up. And it actually looks like this removing the cards from the base is very sophisticated, as opposed to the clownish image that's sometimes given to this particular administration in many areas. This looks like it's systematic, well thought out, and it's the one thing, ironically, that's getting more attention. Now, he never said, "This is what I'm going to do." And it's going to hurt a lot of people in rural areas of this country. It's also going to hurt people in cities, of course, as well. So,
is it fair to say then that he has really beheaded the EPA?
He's changing Washington. One part of Washington people probably would like, if they understood it, is that the federal EPA is what made sure certain weak states in the environmental area didn't destroy things on their own, because the states are part of a partnership with the EPA. You take away the EPA, you also take away the incentives of the states to do the right things. Why would they do the wrong things? Economics. A false belief that you can make a choice. You have to make a choice between jobs and a clean environment. We fought that one in the 60s and 70s, and that's a lie. But that lie, that you have to make that choice, has come back. And people who, their property, their health, are all going to be compromised by these decisions. And so what we're trying to do is make people aware of what's going on.
Right. Can you answer this question? If you call it a house of cards, it's going to collapse, right? So if indeed it hasn't collapsed, is the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act or the Toxic Substances Control Act, are they all equally negatively impacted, or is there one that stands out? For example, if they succeed in dismantling the agency, as they have already done according to what you've explained so clearly here, is there one thing? Will the air become more polluted, the water less safe to drink? Will be Can you say, is it just all across the board?
Well, first of all, we men, Americans, designing laws, have separated things into categories for lawmaking and then subsequent regulation. But of course, air, water, waste, all interrelated. You show me a problem with one, it's probably linked to a problem with the other, but it's predominantly. So for example, breathing the air, definitely. Cleaning up the water,
Drinking
definitely.
water, you mean, mainly?
And drinking water is one of the most alarming because of the deregulation of chemicals that is in the process and coming.
Right. We only have 30 seconds in this show. Would you be willing to come back next week and continue the discussion?
I'm happy to do that and to talk, for example, about drinking water and other problems.
All right. Well, it's good to see you again. And if I may add a personal note, I understand you had your first grandchild.
Yes, little Dahlia, and she's.
Well, let us hope, God willing, that she grows up fit and healthy and drinks safe water, and with people like you and on the job, I'm sure that will happen. But anyway, we'll see you next week, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
As always, thanks to all of you for taking the time to watch. Please watch next week.